Desperate Measures by VVC. Chapter 22. Breakdown and Fallout. Hermione looked up as someone tapped her shoulder. "Yes, Neville?" she asked the concerned-looking boy.
"Have you seen Harry since he said he was going to walk about the castle?"
Neville asked worriedly.
"I've been focused on tutoring the fifth years in herbology, and I haven't noticed."
"Have you checked in the dome?" Hermione asked sensibly. Neville nodded and chewed his lip.
"He's not there. Did he say anything to you?"
"Just that he was going to wander the halls for a bit to think," Hermione said, starting to get worried herself.
"We need to find him,"
Neville said urgently. Hermione nodded and started gathering her papers. "It's almost curfew," she agreed.
"It's not that,"
Neville said. He leaned closer and whispered,
"He entered stage 2 this morning."
Hermione's eyes widened and her gathering speed doubled. "Lavender, Parvati, will you watch my things? Maybe take them upstairs for me?" Hermione called over to her dorm mates. She was satisfied with the nods and vague wave of hands, so she grabbed Neville and the two friends quickly left Gryffindor Tower.
"Where would he go?"
Neville asked urgently.
"You've explored this castle with him more than I have."
"He could be anywhere," Hermione admitted agitatedly. "Harry knows this castle better than any of us."
"Favorite places?"
Neville asked anxiously. "He likes the lake for thinking," Hermione said, then added dismissively, "but it's cold and rainy tonight." Neville stopped abruptly, and Hermione, still holding his arm, was forced to stop as well. He stared at her. Hermione stared back in bewilderment for a moment before her eyes widened. Hermione let go of Neville's arm, and together they set off at a run for the main doors. A few minutes later, Hermione and Neville were cold, wet, and panting. They were, however, correct in their presumption, and were now standing right next to Harry. A Harry who was obviously completely soaked, and if the shivers and shallow breathing were any indication, also hypothermic. "Harry? Harry!" Hermione called to her friend. He seemed dazed, and she was afraid to touch him and startle him. It took another minute before her calls and pleas were heard.
"Hermione?"
Harry mumbled. "Yes, it's me," Hermione said in relief. She was freezing already from just a few minutes outside, and Harry was obviously worse. They needed to get him inside quickly. "Neville's here too. We're going to take you back inside now, all right? All you have to do is let us guide you back inside. Can you do that?" Harry frowned and thought, as if he had to decipher the words.
"Sure,"
he said eventually. Hermione and Neville each took one of Harry's arms and started leading him back to the castle. Harry stumbled several times but kept his feet when he offered help. Neville had just closed the main doors when Harry mumbled something. "What was that, Harry?" Hermione asked as Neville rejoined them.
"I could have made it with him,"
Harry mumbled again, his friends straining to hear.
"I would have been happy, I think."
"Who, Harry?" Hermione asked as she tried to get her friend moving once again. He didn't budge, though, so she took the opportunity to start casting several drying and warming charms.
"Martin,"
Harry mumbled.
I liked him a lot. He was very kind, and he felt so nice. His magic, it was wonderful. We could have made it. Maybe I should just pick."
Hermione bit her lip at her friend's words and shared a nervous glance with Neville. "Did you see him today?" she asked, then went back to her spells. Harry nodded, then started giggling a bit hysterically.
"He's Death Eater,"
he burbled.
"A Death Eater. I like a Death Eater. I really like him. And he likes me."
"Harry," Neville interrupted pleadingly. "Come on, let's get upstairs." But Harry refused to move.
"He's a widower with one son and one daughter,"
Harry continued, oblivious to his friend's growing concern.
"He likes to swim in the ocean and collect shells. He likes French food and thinks I'm attractive. We could be good mates, except it's too early to mate with him."
"Harry, we need to go upstairs now," Hermione said firmly once she was done with the charms. She tugged on his arm and was relieved when Harry started moving obediently.
"It's too early for him,"
Harry said absently.
"The mark, a bond right now couldn't conquer both a mark and my scar, so it's too early for him. But maybe not for others. Ian or Gustav or Michael. Maybe Draco. His magic's nice."
"What?" Hermione squeaked. Surely Harry hadn't said what she thought he had.
"Harry!"
Neville said sharply with a firm shake to Harry's arm.
"You can't talk about them here. The walls have ears."
He gave Hermione a stern look and was satisfied she would keep her silence when she bit her lip and nodded.
Harry frowned. "Maybe I should just pick. But which one? And it's too early. But maybe not. Maybe it would work, but probably not. So I have to wait, but maybe it would work. Martin would be a good mate." Harry's voice abruptly cut off and Neville gave Hermione a surprised look. Hermione looked slightly embarrassed over her silencing spell, but nevertheless resolute. "He's completely off in his own world and running around in circles," Hermione said. "I don't think you can trust him not to say something he shouldn't." Neville nodded in understanding. She was right, of course, but his babbling will tell us if he's getting better or worse. You'll have to take it off when we get to the tower. "I will," Hermione agreed. She swallowed anxiously and asked softly, Why is he like this? Do you know? It seems more than what can be accounted for by hypothermia." "I told you," Neville answered back just as softly. "He entered second stage this morning." "But nothing I've read said anything about this confusion," Hermione protested, still keeping her voice low. "It said that the dangerous signs were pain and anger." Neville shook his head and kept Harry upright as he stumbled up a flight of stairs. Once again on flat ground, he answered grimly, "He's passed through that already. The confusion is a sign of him starting to spiral down into secondary magical shock. The fact that he's freezing, and probably in physical shock too, certainly isn't helping matters any." "No," Hermione moaned in dismay. Magical shock versus magical degeneration is what killed Veela submissives on Desespore stage entry days. "It's not critical just yet," Neville said, only somewhat reassuringly. "We need to get him warmed up and stabilized. I won't be able to do it alone." "I'll help," Hermione promised immediately. "Anything." Neville shook his head. "No, I'm sorry. He thinks your magic feels nice, but it's not going to be nice enough to get him restabilized. I'm going to need Lavender to help. We'll have to strip down so we can have skin-to-skin contact. We'll also—" "She'll never!" Hermione interrupted. She was completely shocked that Neville would suggest such a thing. "She will," Neville said with certainty. "She already told me so. You can still help, though. We need to keep him awake and talking as long as possible." Hermione drew in a deep breath and let it out slowly. "All right," she said with forced calm. "Can you get Harry to the tower by yourself? I can go up and warn her." "That's a good idea," Neville said as he once again kept Harry from falling flat on his face. "And I can manage. Maybe you could kick everyone out of the common room and set up some bedding by the fire." Hermione nodded, then made sure Neville had a firm hold on Harry before once more breaking into a sprint. She contemplated the situation as she huffed up yet another set of stairs. She'd known about skin-to-skin contact being the best and fastest way for a submissive to regain magical stability, at least what magical stability they still had, not to mention recovering from hypothermia, but... Well, for one, after Harry's assurances that he would do his best to live, she had really not expected the situation to come up when he entered stage 2. For another, even if it did, she'd not realized that anyone other than Neville would be involved. To think that she was going to be sitting with 3 naked people in her common room. Hermione made it up the last set of stairs and immediately slowed to a walk. She didn't want to sound winded or desperate when she ordered everyone to bed. She made it to the portrait of the fat lady and stopped to take several calming breaths. When she felt she was ready, she gave the password and entered into the common room. No one seemed to notice her entrance. Well, that would change. "Everyone is to go to their dorms," Hermione ordered loudly. There were quite a number of protests after the initial shock of her pronouncement wore off. She caught Lavender's eye and tilted her head slightly towards the fire. She was grateful when the other girl's eyes widened in understanding and she leaned in towards Parvati and began whispering. Parvati nodded and picked up her things as well as Lavender's and Hermione's. "I didn't mean an hour from now," Hermione said sternly. "Everyone, to bed!" She started glaring at everyone who wasn't moving to her satisfaction and was gratified when several people quickly scurried off. 5+ years with Snape for a teacher had to be good for something. It took nearly 2 minutes to clear the common room. It was a miracle, surely, but it was still too long in Hermione's opinion. She had a bed to make, a fire to get roaring, and a classmate to inform. "How bad is he?" Lavender asked once everyone else had left. Or maybe not. She hated to admit it, but Lavender did seem to have a head on her shoulders. It was just filled with much different information and priorities than her own. "Bad, but not critical," Hermione said briskly as she pulled her wand and pointed it determinedly at the fire. The fire jumped sharply in response, turning from the small cozy flame it had been into a roaring blaze. "The idiot has been standing outside in the cold and rain for Merlin knows how long," Hermione said sharply, her worry turning her tone angry. "He's confused and babbling and his thoughts are running around in circles." She started floating furniture away from the fire. "Secondary magical shock, then," Lavender said as she pulled her own wand and helped move the furniture out of the way. Hermione pursed her lips and didn't respond to the comment.
Neville should be along with him in a few minutes. We need to make a bed here and get the room warmed up. You to the bed, Lavender said. You're better at transfiguration than I am. I can handle the temperature charms. Hermione nodded wordlessly and turned her attention to transfiguring one of the couches into a nice big mattress, one that would easily fit 3 snuggling people. She turned one of the chairs into a smaller mattress slightly off to one side. Every last pillow and cushion was then sacrificed to become bedpillows, sheets, blankets, and quilts for the 2 beds. She had just barely finished when the portrait opened and Neville guided Harry into the common room. She absently noted that the temperature had risen a good 5 degrees. As Neville got closer, Hermione said, I was putting quilts on the beds when I started wondering why you suggested the common room. Why not your dorm? Because you have the authority to kick everyone out of here, Neville said as he stood Harry by the larger mattress and started undoing buttons. Hermione blushed and quickly turned around. A dorm room would be safer. We could keep everyone out. She heard Lavender change her spell from air-warming charms to cloth-warming charms, presumably charming the bedding. But boys can't get to the girls' dorms, and you're not allowed to kick the boys out of their dorms, Neville said matter-of-factly. They could certainly agree of their own accord, but you know there are some, like Ron, who wouldn't agree just because it's for Harry. This isn't ideal, but it's the best option we've got. I'm sure we could get one of the boys' dorms cleared out, Hermione said, resolutely ignoring the sound of rustling clothes behind her. We don't have time, Neville denied. We need to get Harry stabilized now, not half an hour from now after we finally manage to convince one of the year groups to vacate their room for the night. Plus, we don't want him to become even more upset from witnessing some petty argument centered around him getting preferential treatment or whatnot. Lavender, hold him a minute while I get undressed. The room of requirements? Hermione asked plaintively and pretended she hadn't heard Neville's last words. Which is on the top floor on the other side of the castle, Neville said. Just how long do you think it would have taken us to get there? We could go to the infirmary, Hermione suggested half-heartedly. She knew how much Harry hated the infirmary. Not a good idea to have him somewhere he doesn't like when we're trying to calm him down, Neville said with a small snort. Besides, he doesn't want Madame Pomfrey anywhere near him. One of these days he might even tell me why. Hermione sighed but nodded her understanding. She took off her own shoes and socks and robe, then transfigured her clothes into pajamas. She waited for another minute, listening to the rustling of sheets and quilts and occasional soft urging behind her. We're all covered now, Neville said. You need to take off the silencing charm. Do you think you can try to get him talking coherently? He always did seem to listen to you more than anyone else. Hermione turned around and blushed. She couldn't see anything, but still, she knew all 3 of the people under the covers were naked. The clothes piles were right there. Harry was sandwiched between Neville behind him and Lavender in front. From the location of the lumps, she surmised that Neville, laying on his side, had his arms around Harry, and Harry, also on his side, has his around Lavender. Lavender was lying on her back and had Harry's head pillowed halfway on her right shoulder and halfway on her right breast. She hoped Harry's hands never strayed anywhere inappropriate. All 3 were shivering. How long would it take to warm up Harry to normal temperatures? Hermione! The spell? Neville prompted. Oh, of course, Hermione said, startled out of her straying thoughts. She removed her silencing charm and all 3 immediately heard Harry's babbling. He was still stuck in his previous circular reasoning. Harry sat down on her own mattress facing Harry. She interrupted him sharply. Harry, pay attention. I have some questions. And it was true. She did have questions. It took the better part of 4 hours, but she did eventually get all her answers, too. Of course, she also got quite a bit of information she hadn't asked for and was certain Harry wouldn't have let out had he been in his right mind. Who were his favorite tutors and why? A list of 12 men and a veritable dissertation on what gifts they had given him and what their dates had been like. Despite the fact that Harry had already mentioned the name once, she'd been shocked down to her toes when Harry had started in on Draco Malfoy, and even more shocked when the information about the Malfoy family's clandestine operations had been spilled. She was comforted by the fact that both Neville and Lavender had also been highly shocked, at least about what the Malfoy family was doing. Neville had evidently already known Malfoy had been courting Harry, and Lavender thought the whole situation was romantic. That shock had been matched just a little bit later by the revelation of the identity, the full identity, of Harry's chaperone. Grandfather, she could handle. She'd almost suspected a family relation anyway. After all, it made sense for her that Harry would search out that part of his family once he'd found out about its existence. But just who the grandfather was? Well, that had had her choking, Neville squeaking, and Lavender giggling in delight. What were his favorite gifts? That had opened a floodgate. A quilt, his boots, the cloak, the vortex, the hawk ring, a pendant, a sweater, books, and more books. She'd reconciled that her friend was turning into nearly as much of a bookworm as herself, and so wasn't surprised at the number of books he listed. She was surprised, however, when she realized that quite a number of those gifts were from Draco Malfoy. She wasn't sure how she felt about that either. How did he plan on passing his newts after missing a whole year of schooling? She'd only been mildly surprised to find out that Harry had done a lot of extra studying last year in preparation. Harry could be rather sneaky, and doubtless he'd used his temper as an excuse to be alone to good advantage. She'd been horrified, though, when Harry had admitted that he didn't care how well he did on his newts. She'd ranted at him a good 5 minutes about that, despite his excuses. Just because he wanted to be a full-time parent didn't mean that he should neglect his education. He'd laughed at her weakly, and she'd been so delighted that he was coherent enough to find humor in the situation that she'd dropped the subject. She'd continued to relentlessly question Harry about anything she could think of, and slowly both Harry's speech and answers had become more coherent. The fight to keep him awake, however, had gotten more and more difficult as Harry slipped closer and closer to sleep. It was midnight by the time Harry fell completely asleep and could not be roused. She'd been nearly frantic until Neville had reassured her that it was probably a normal sleep. She'd asked then if they should get him into his own bed and seek their own, but both Neville and Lavender had refused. To take away the stabilizing influences now would only ensure that Harry didn't wake at all. She'd not made another protest and had instead set an alarm for 6 in the morning before curling into her temporary bed. 6 should allow them plenty of time to redress and set everything to rights before pursuing their normal morning routines. She, Neville, and Lavender fell asleep quickly once the lights were dimmed, the stress of the evening having exhausted them all. 6 in the morning proved more than sufficient time to untransfigure everything and put the common room back to its normal state and still have time for a nice shower. It also proved more than sufficient time to reassure Harry that none of the secrets he had unwittingly revealed the previous night would ever pass their lips without his permission. Other than the early wake-up, the morning had gone normally. Neville had given Harry his honey candy, and the two had showered, dressed, and walked down to breakfast together. Hermione had showered and dressed with perfect efficiency, sniffed at her dorm mate's antics with hair and makeup, and went to breakfast with her nose in a book. Lavender had ignored Hermione's disdain, made herself beautiful, and walked to breakfast with Parvati. It was why none of them were prepared when the Daily Prophet arrived. Harry Potter, caught in a menage a trois. There in bold color and taking up half the page was a picture of Neville, Harry, and Lavender spooned together in front of the fire. The gasps were loud, and gossip started immediately. Harry hissed angrily and clenched his fists. Neville placed his left hand over Harry's right fist and started speaking urgently, telling Harry that the paper didn't matter. Lavender joined in with her own assurances and covered Harry's left fist with both her hands. Hermione ignored them all and quickly skimmed the article. And wasn't it convenient that their source was neatly listed? From the contents of the article, it was apparent that the little spy had taken his picture and started eavesdropping about an hour after they'd got Harry settled into bed. He must have called an owl to him from his dorm window and sent the picture and his report off to the paper a bit after 10 o'clock. Even if the owl hadn't arrived until 3 or 4 in the morning, there would still have been enough time to stop the presses and rewrite the feature article. She castigated herself for failing to cast any privacy spells, but at least what had been overheard was quite minor. When Hermione looked up from her reading, it was abundantly clear that Harry's temper was not going to be kept in check with a few reassuring words. She reached across the table and placed a hand on Harry's face. When she had his attention, she very deliberately said, "Fuck them, Harry!" Harry's was not the only jaw that dropped at Hermione's wholly uncharacteristic profanity. Someone even snorted their tea. Having completely derailed Harry's anger, Hermione once again said, "Fuck them, Harry!" She glanced around briefly before focusing again on her friend with an intent look. "Nothing of importance was overheard and reported, just a bit about some of your favorite gifts. And anybody who believes the prophets is not worth your time. Consider it easy suitor elimination." As planned, Harry was so flabbergasted with her swearing and her cold statement that all he could do was stare at her. She removed her hand and slowly stood up and glared the hall into silence. Everyone, students and teachers alike, gazed at her in wide-eyed surprise. Never before had Hermione Granger looked so intimidating, like a queen looking down condescendingly on unworthy subjects. Hermione turned her glare to Colin Creevy and was gratified when the boy quailed from a gaze. You have a written injunction against you in regards to taking pictures of many of your schoolmates, she said coldly. Colin got an angry, stubborn look on his face and opened his mouth. To say what, nobody would know, as Hermione talked over him. For violating the injunction in regards to Neville Longbottom, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said and watched as Colin flinched. Too bad 25 was her limit as a prefect. For violating the injunction in regards to Harry Potter, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said and watched Colin grow pale. 50 points was a lot to lose for your house, and it was obvious that wasn't the end. For violating the injunction in regards to Lavender Brown, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione continued relentlessly. Colin's face became angry again, and he looked about to protest, but she wasn't done. It is against school rules to send pictures of your classmates to any publication without the prior written consent, Hermione stated. She ignored the gasps scattered about the hall as some of them recognized what she was about to do. For violating the rule in regards to Neville Longbottom, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said calmly. Colin's eyes went wide in alarm, and she stopped a vindictive smile from coming over her face. For violating the rule in regards to Harry Potter, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said and took pleasure from the shocked murmurs surrounding her. For violating the rule in regards to Lavender Brown, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said, rounding off the set. Colin looked like he was ready to faint, but she still wasn't done. It is against school rules to send reports of your classmates' conversations to any publication without their prior written consent, Hermione said implacably. She noted but ignored McGonagall's pinched face. For violating the rule in regards to Neville Longbottom, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said. Colin was breathing fast, and the hall had regained its silence as the students listened to her in disbelief. For violating the rule in regards to Harry Potter, 25 points from Gryffindor, she said, and absently noted the look of glee upon the face of Professor Snape. For violating the rule in regards to Lavender Brown, 25 points from Gryffindor, Hermione said, and ignored the whimpers coming from several of her housemates. For violating the rule in regards to myself, 25 points from Gryffindor, she finished and watched in satisfaction as Colin finally did faint. She swept her gaze regally around the hall. Quite a number of people actually leaned away from her. She'd just taken 250 points from her own house and didn't look the least bit upset. Everyone was shocked. Most of the students were intimidated, and a few of the teachers were wondering where this lioness had been hiding the last 5.5 years. Hermione sat back down, replaced her napkin in her lap, and picked up her fork. Ate your breakfast, Harry. Harry, too stunned to think, obeyed. The rest of the hall, most still speechless, followed suit. Monday morning saw nearly the entire Gryffindor house practicing their aim and their newly learned spell, courtesy of Hermione, on the plethora of incoming howlers! Most were destroyed from within the very feet and beaks of indignant delivery owls, but given the sheer volume of howlers, quite a number made it through to Harry, Neville, and Lavender. After the racket from the successfully delivered howlers finally quieted, a familiar eagle screech was heard. The entire school looked up to where Nicole was circling, and everybody noticed the lack of red in her talons. Harry, stony-faced, stood and allowed the eagle to land on his protected fist. Nicole spread her wings, nearly a full 8 feet, and let out another loud screech before folding her wings primly, bobbing her head, and twittering. Harry sat back down and reached for the ties of one of the packages tied to Nicole's legs. He was surprised when, instead of being her normal cooperative self, Nicole hopped off her fist and waddled over to Lavender. Unlike everybody else watching the scene, Lavender appeared completely unsurprised and started cooing over the eagle. Hermione cleared her throat pointedly and said, I imagine one of those packages is for you. Lavender continued to coo her praise of the pretty lady, but did identify and untie the small package that was meant for her. Lavender gave the eagle a piece of bacon, and everyone watched, still amazed, as the eagle hopped and waddled over to Neville instead of returning to Harry. Neville looked at Harry. "This doesn't look like a howler," he said needlessly. He wasn't showing it, but he was quite rattled over being the target of so much negativity. "No," Harry said as he looked steadily back. What was Draco doing? Both boys looked over at Lavender as she let loose a loud squeal of delight. Nicole stole the sausage off Neville's plate while he was distracted. "Somebody knows exactly what I like!" Lavender exclaimed as she held up a slim bracelet. "Was there a note?" Hermione asked curiously. Lavender passed a small card to Hermione, then held out the bracelet for admiration. "It's a Deluska!" Harry's eyebrows rose as he recognized the famous designer from his lessons with Lavender. Whatever the bracelet was, even if it was just plain gold, it was rather pricey. He obligingly examined the bracelet and was dutifully impressed with the small sapphire and diamond flowers that adorned alternating links. Yes, very nice. He turned his gaze back to Neville, who was even more wide-eyed than before. "It just says thank you," Hermione said in bemusement as she stared at the small card that had been handed to her. Obviously, Malfoy understood what had really happened, but for him to send a present to Lavender and Neville, she resisted the urge to turn around and look for the blonde. Neville swallowed and looked back at the eagle in front of him. "Hey!" he exclaimed as Nicole swiped a second sausage. Harry snickered. "Serves you right," he said. Neville snorted and reached slowly for the 2 packages still tied to the eagle's right leg. The first one he untied was addressed to Harry, so he passed it over, still trying to procrastinate opening his own package. He looked at Harry expectantly. Harry gave his own snort, but obligingly opened his package. The letter was nice, filled with concern and best wishes for his health. He smiled at the book on spells used on Egyptian pottery and opened his new box of chocolate frogs. He opened one of the treats, captured a bit off the head of the enclosed frog, and looked at its accompanying card. "Yes!" he cried, bumping his fist in the air. "Frog Blucher!" Neville gave another snort and shook his head. Harry and his cards. He left Harry to his celebration and untied the last package from the eagle's leg. He handed the eagle a piece of bacon and said, "You leave my sausage alone!" The bird merely twittered at him. Neville opened the accompanying card first. Unlike Lavender, his said more than simply, "Thank you." Malfoy had written that he knew Neville's support was one of the primary reasons for Harry remaining as calm as he had while at school, and thanked him for showing such courage and loyalty. Malfoy had then stated that he was aware of Neville's interest in herbology. Well, of course he was! And hoped that the enclosed book helped him in pursuit of his chosen path. "Well?" Hermione asked curiously. Neville hesitated, but decided to share the short letter with his friends. He was a bit embarrassed with the praise it gave him, but there was nothing in the note that ought to be kept secret. He turned his attention to his package and unwrapped it slowly. He gasped when he saw the title! "What is it?" Hermione asked, craning her neck in an attempt to view the title. She passed Neville's note to Harry, using that as an excuse to lean farther forward to get a better look. "The complete works of Helga Hufflepuff, annotated!" Neville breathed in reverence as he traced the embossed title with a shaky finger. "I've always wanted a copy, but Gran won't buy one for me. She says it's too expensive. The school has a copy, but it can't be checked out." "Expensive like wizarding culture's expensive?" Hermione asked curiously. She did well in herbology, of course, but couldn't remember this title, and considering it was the work of one of the founders. Neville nodded. "It's 100 galleons! It's all of Helga Hufflepuff's works and more! It lists her original experiments and results, and then lists all the results of those same experiments done with modern equipment and measuring devices. The experiments she wanted to do but couldn't or didn't get to were done and the results are listed. The questions she had about different plants and, well, lots of different things have been answered if possible. This is just fantastic!" "It sounds like a great reference," Hermione said, impressed. Neville looked up and blinked in surprise. Slowly, he started to grin. "Actually, it's not," he said. "It's more of a historical record and example of how to go about doing herbal research and how more accurate methods can yield different results. It's completely fascinating, and every master herbologist has one. This is brilliant!" Hermione smiled at Neville's excitement. "Congratulations, Neville. You deserve it." Neville blushed and stammered, "Thanks!"
Hi, Neville.
Harry said with amusement. Yes! Neville asked as he turned to see Harry's smiling face.
Do you want to write a thank you note now, or do you want to save the rest of your sausages and send one off next week?
Harry asked with a laugh. What? Neville said, then turned to see Nicole ripping apart yet another of his sausages. Hey! Everyone nearby giggled or laughed at Neville's predicament.
Come here, girl.
Harry crooned. Nicole picked up the half sausage in her beak and waddled over to Harry and stepped onto his proffered arm.
Did you get enough today?
Nicole twittered as she transferred her sausage to a talon and ripped off another bite.
Do you need to wait for responses today, or will it be alright to wait until next week?
Harry asked. He interpreted the complicated response of Twitter, Bob, and Flap as it being acceptable to wait a week.
Alright then. Let me just tie on last week's thank you note, and we'll see you next Monday.
Nicole was finished with her sausage by the time Harry completed his task, and he stood and launched her into the air. The eagle gave one more mighty screech just before leaving the school. Harry put away his present and the piles of non-howler letters his housemates had collected for him and continued his breakfast. Despite the howlers, not to mention the news articles in the Prophet still condemning him, he had good and light-hearted conversations with his surrounding housemates and friends. It wasn't until he was leaving that the day went south. I don't know why you're pretending to go on a date. Nobody's going to want you now that it's been proven you're just a greedy whore. The hall went silent. The foul words loud enough for even the teachers to hear.
Harry went still, and everybody held their breath.
Salazar's tits! Draco hissed out. He'd known Michael Ryan was one stupid little Hufflepuff, but this went above and beyond being a complete fool. They'd all be lucky indeed if Harry didn't kill everyone in his fury. It was never good news when a Veela, especially a submissive, went completely still like that. It was never a question of if fireballs would be thrown. It was always a question of how many and how much damage and loss of life. He didn't, Pansy choked out, utterly shocked. He did, Draco hissed out.
Marlin, Theodore breathed in horror. We're all dead.
Start evacuating, Draco commanded. Leave one at a time and pick up a younger year on your way out. Walk slowly. No one moved. No one would remember later if it was because of paralyzing fear or morbid fascination, and Draco didn't care. Now! He demanded harshly and was grateful when Blaise Zabini carefully stood to follow his instructions. Go! He said to Theodore not a second later. He didn't take notice as the elder students of his house started filing out slowly, reaching out and hauling a random younger year with them as they passed the far end of the table. Draco turned to the Ravenclaw table and the only other half-Veela at Hogwarts and called softly but urgently, Conway! The Ravenclaw didn't respond. He simply stared in horrified anticipation as Harry's wings slowly sprouted from his back. Conway! Get it together! Draco said harshly. Conway started and looked over at Draco with wide, fearful eyes. How is your fire? Draco asked quickly. What? Conway asked in confusion. How is your fire? Draco asked again in irritation. Can you help counter his fireballs? Good enough, Conway said with a grim expression, finally over his shock and determined to do his best to ameliorate the coming destruction. How good? Draco pressed. Good enough, Malfoy, Conway said in irritation, then turned to his neighbor. Copy the Slytherins, one at a time, slowly. Pick up a firstie. Go. The Ravenclaws started their evacuation just as flames became visible around Harry's fists. All of those walking away couldn't help but move just a little bit faster despite the warning to move slowly. What the bloody hell is he doing? Conway asked in a combination of fear, anger, and amazement. Draco turned his attention from the Gryffindor table, where somebody with a brain, probably Granger, had also started a slow evacuation, back to Harry, and now Neville Longbottom. He's got bigger bollocks than the rest of that house put together, Draco said, and meant it wholeheartedly. He would never approach an enraged submissive, not for a million galleons. By the Queen, Conway gasped as Harry turned and Neville Longbottom stepped up close behind Harry and clasped his hands around Harry's forearms. Draco nodded in agreement and continued to watch in trepidation as Longbottom spoke softly to Harry. What he wouldn't get to know just what Longbottom was saying at this moment that was so effectively delaying a submissive's rage. The stupid bastard's scarman, Conway whispered. Does he have a death wish? Draco glanced at Conway, then sent his gaze over to the imbecile that had endangered the entire student population. Ryan was being held by a fellow housemate. Draco thought it might be a second year, and was indeed struggling. A bigger boy had a hand over Ryan's mouth and an arm around the younger boy's body. It would only be a matter of time, though, before one or both slipped and Ryan was free. Longbottom talked. Harry fumed. Ryan struggled, and Draco and Conway hid their hands below the table and called up their own fire. Any minute. Any minute. Half the students had left the hall completely, and most of the others were on their way out when Ryan stomped on his captor's foot and got free. "I'm not scared of you!"
Oh, wrong thing to say,
Conway muttered. Draco lifted his hands from beneath the table and finished calling up a fireball just as Harry screeched and pulled his arms from Longbottom's grasp. Draco propelled his fireball to intercept the one Harry had just thrown at Ryan, noting that Conway's fireball was right beside his. When the explosion cleared, Draco noticed that the second year was obviously quite valuable in a crisis as he knocked Ryan to the floor. Draco watched in surprise and approval as the second year grabbed Ryan's hair, lifted the boy's head, and then smashed it down hard onto the stone floor. A second fireball flew over the boys on the floor and impacted on the Hufflepuff table, a second fireball missing intercepting it by less than a foot. "Damn it!" Draco said he had let his attention wander to completely immaterial things. Who cared if the brat got roasted? The next quarter hour was lost to blazing fire and furious screeching. Draco had no time to contemplate anything as he threw fireball after fireball on intercepting courses, not all of them connecting to their targets. He absently noted that the remaining teachers were helping by putting out as many fires as they could. They had done their best. Merlin knew both he and Conway were exhausted, and the teachers looked rather frazzled as well. Draco was pretty sure, though, that all the students, including a dazed Ryan, unfortunately, had gotten safely out of the Great Hall. He was also pretty sure that it was only through their efforts that the Head and Gryffindor tables were still intact. The Slytherin and Ravenclaw tables had been ignored by Harry, and so had suffered no damage in his fiery rampage. The Hufflepuff table, however, well, Longbottom had evidently been encouraging Harry to target the table instead of the students and teachers, and Draco and Conway had come to some unspoken agreement to support that course of action and stopped intercepting fireballs when the target was just the Hufflepuff table. And the teachers' firefighting skills hadn't been sufficient to counter Harry's determined assault. As a result, well, the Hufflepuff table and its benches were completely and utterly destroyed. Ash and the occasional charred piece of wood was all that was left. Draco idly wondered where the Hufflepuffs would sit to eat, then decided he didn't care. He watched tiredly as Harry regained his human form under the murmurings of Neville Longbottom, then allowed the huskier boy to turn him and lead him out of the Great Hall. "Malfoy," Conway said quietly. "Conway," Draco said. "We're talking about the headmaster," Conway stated flatly. "If that little blighter isn't out of here by 7, he'll be joining his house table as an ash pile." "Make it 5, Draco said darkly. "That'll give us time to hunt him down if he decides to be difficult." Duh. Draco held in a wince as Conway's claw gripped his shoulder even tighter. Despite himself, he was impressed. He could impartial shift. "You do not understand, Headmaster," Conway said flatly. "This is not a request. This is not a suggestion. This is not a negotiation. This is not even a demand. This is simply a fact. If that fool is still within the confines of Hogwarts grounds at 5 o'clock, he will be eliminated." "I'm sure this can be resolved peaceably," the headmaster said placatingly. Draco hissed his fury, and a flame popped up around his right hand. A moment later, the flame died as Conway's grip tightened yet again. He did wince this time as he felt a claw pierce his skin. He held his tongue, though. He may not like it. In fact, he didn't like it at all. But it was Conway's place as the elder of them to discuss the situation with the headmaster. "Tell me, Headmaster, have you never wondered just why it is that the Ravenclaws and Slytherins, especially the Slytherins, have not run afoul of the submissive's temper?" Conway asked, his voice still flat and betraying no emotion. "I have," admitted Pomona Sprout, ignoring the slightly disapproving look she received from Albus. Conway turned his head to look at the Hufflepuff head of house. He ignored the other heads and the headmaster as he answered her unspoken question. "I spoke to my entire house the night of the welcoming feast. I told them exactly what could be expected as to the submissive's behavior and exactly how they were to act. I told them that if any of them so much as looked at him wrong and aggravated him, then they would answer to me. I showed them just how destructive my fireballs could be. I very clearly stated that he was under my personal protection.
When I was done with them, they were all very clear on the concept of what they were and were not allowed to say and do in regards to Harry Potter, a Veela submissive in my territory that I was responsible for.
But you don't even have any interaction with Mr. Potter, McGonagall protested angrily. How can you possibly claim to be protecting him?
I spoke with him the very next morning, Conway refuted. He told me that he did not need my teachings, had no interest in my companionship, and that the best way I could protect him was by keeping my house in line. Otherwise, he wanted nothing to do with me and requested I stay away. He asked me to pass the same on to Malfoy, and I did. Conway glanced at the younger dominant in his grasp, then turned his gaze back to Professor Sprout. I imagine that Malfoy had much the same talk with Slytherin House, if at a slightly later date, because his duties as a Veela override any prior disagreements he may have had with the submissive. Gryffindor House obviously has Granger to keep them in line for the most part. Tell me, did any of you bother with such a talk with the Hufflepuffs?
The headmaster opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by his door being opened and instead frowned in irritation. Once again his guardian had let through visitors without his permission. He narrowed his eyes at the Veela guard that stepped into his office.
May I help you?
The guard glanced at the occupants of the room, noted the two youngsters, and said,
I am here to inform you that Neville Longbottom will not be attending classes today. Mr. Potter has refused to relinquish the young man's presence.
No, see here!
Minerva McGonagall started to protest.
Shut up!
Conway ordered flatly. If the submissive requires the presence of his friend to calm himself due to your total lack of foresight in eliminating a very real irritant, then so be it. I'm also here to determine what is being done about the irritant, the guard said emotionlessly. He will be off Hogwarts grounds by 5 o'clock, or he will be eliminated by myself and Malfoy.
Conway replied with a nod of respect towards the senior Veela. The guard nodded back and stood to watch the rest of the meeting.
You cannot randomly kill students,
the headmaster admonished sternly.
What he said may...
It will not be random, Conway interrupted, and as we could claim his life for his words, I would think you would be jumping at our mercy.
There was silence in the office for several moments as the teachers tried to formulate arguments to sway the implacable Ravenclaw.
Even Snape tried to think up an argument, despite the fact that he thought the world would be a better place with one less imbecile. We have nothing else to say, Conway said firmly and turned toward the door, turning Malfoy with him and pushing him ahead. The guard opened the door and the two of them left. The guard could deal with the protests of the teacher. Conway pushed Malfoy ahead of him for several corridors before taking them into an empty classroom and shutting the door. He locked the door with a spell and cast several privacy charms, then turned to Malfoy. Let me fix your shoulder, he said. Draco nodded and remained still as Conway cast a minor healing spell, which sealed the small puncture in his shoulder from Conway's claws, followed by spells to banish blood and repair cloth. He watched the elder half-Veela warily, recognizing that Conway was indeed still acting as a Veela and not a student. You're courting him, aren't you? Conway asked harshly. Draco stiffened and blanked his expression, but did not speak. Conway snorted mirthlessly. Your response gives me my answer, he said. I was almost certain while we were with the teachers. You're too upset about the situation with that brat.
And you're not?
Draco demanded angrily. Oh, I am, Conway said with a grim smile. But you're acting more protective than I am, and also are obviously taking this more personally than I am.
Draco pressed his lips together and looked away, unable to contradict Conway's statements. Damn, who else had picked up on the truth?
If it makes you feel any better, I don't think anyone else realizes it, Conway said with a shrug. The teachers are obviously ignorant and won't know enough to recognize that your response was beyond normal. Draco grimaced at Conway's words. He wasn't so sure he agreed. Severus Snape's association with Lucius Malfoy, a Y-male half-Veela from a line of Y-males, had given him a more than cursory understanding of Veela. Hopefully the man's irrational hatred of all things Potter would blind him to the likely reason behind Draco's anger. I can't believe you're caught on him, Conway said, shaking his head in disbelief. He nearly killed you. You'd be dead if Madame Pomfrey hadn't been right there.
I'm well aware of that, thank you,
Draco said irritably. The near-death experience had opened his eyes to quite a number of things. I can't believe he's letting you, Conway said, then looked intently at Draco. Why is he letting you court him? Draco contemplated not answering the question, but decided Conway probably wouldn't let him go without a fight if he didn't.
He sighed in resignation and said, He doesn't know. I've been using an alias.
Conway blinked in surprise. That's not going to work when you go on your date, he said eventually, and it can't have worked when you went to those meetings last year. Draco's face twitched slightly.
I didn't go to those meetings, he said. I asked to be excused and he agreed. and I used a glamour on our date, which went very well, I'll have you know. Conway stared incredulously at the younger half-Veela for merely a full minute.
I'd love to know why he allowed those things, but it's none of my business. Still, this deception is a bad idea, Malfoy. I've spoken to Potter only that once, but even I know that. He's going to be furious when he finds out your identity.
I'm working on that, Draco said tightly, refusing to give the details of his courtship.
You're working on that,
Conway repeated in disbelief. Yes! Draco ground out. I'm working on it! By the time he finds out who I am, I believe that he will accept me. I know I've got a fair chance. Conway was silent for several moments.
You know,
Malfoy, maybe you do, he said thoughtfully.
I've known you nearly your whole life, and you've always been a bit of a snob. You only turned into an obnoxious prick once you started Hogwarts. Even over the summer and winter holidays, you're not nearly as much of a bastard as you are at school. Why is that? Are you hiding? Towing the line until you're of age, before going off to do your own thing?
None of your business, Draco said stiffly. Damn, he was so close. Merlin, don't let Conway screw this up for him by tattling his suspicions about the courtships.
It's your father, isn't it? Conway mused softly. But you'll be 17 soon, won't you? Isn't your birthday in the spring?
June 5th, Draco said, then added angrily. So you can keep your mouth shut until then?
Sure, Draco,
Conway said with a small smile and clasped the boy's shoulder.
Good luck,
he said sincerely and dropped his spells and left the room. Draco stared after Conway, his emotions running wild. The fear and anger from the incident in the Great Hall, the disgust and fury from the talk with the headmaster and heads of house, the fear of what he might have given away, and the deadly consequences that could engender for both him and Pansy. All these left him shaking. Draco slowly dropped to his knees and spent the next half hour getting himself back under control. 1 more month, 30 more days, and it wouldn't matter who knew what or what they said. Just 1 more month, and his father would no longer have custody of him, and he and Pansy would be free.